Some stories just stick around, they have no ending, and that's why we can't let them go. The story of the Mary Celeste is one of those. It's the ultimate ghost ship. A perfectly good vessel found sailing on its own in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Its crew, captain, and the captain's family were simply gone. No note, no sign of a struggle. Nothing to explain why 10 people would vanish off the face of the earth, leaving their ship behind. To understand what happened, or at least to try, you have to start at the beginning. Before it was the Mary Celeste, it was the Amazon. It was built in Nova Scotia in 1861. And right from the start, the ship seemed to have bad luck. Its first captain died of pneumonia just a few days into its maiden voyage. On that same trip, it hit a fishing weir and then collided with another brig in the English Channel. It wasn't a great start. The ship passed through several owners and it never seemed to bring them much luck. It was eventually sold to American owners, repaired and renamed. In 1872, it was called the Mary Celeste, a fresh start for a troubled ship. Its new captain was a man named Benjamin Spooner Briggs. By all accounts, he was a good man, a devout Christian, a teetotaler, and a highly experienced and respected mariner. He was 37 years old. He wasn't some rookie who would panic at the first sign of trouble. He was part owner of the ship, so he had a real stake in its success. He believed in this vessel. So much so that he brought his family with him. His wife Sarah and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia were to join him on the voyage from New York to Genoa, Italy. They left their 7-year-old son Arthur at home with his grandmother so he could go to school. That decision saved his life. The crew was small, just 7 men. First mate Albert Richardson was also a man Briggs trusted completely. The second mate, Andrew Gilling, was young, in his mid-20s. The steward and cook was Edward Head. The 4 seamen were Germans Volkert and Bos Lorenzen, Arian Martins, and Gottlieb Gautschall. They were said to be good, capable sailors. There was no indication of any trouble or discontent among them before they set sail. It looked like a standard professional crew. The cargo was what would become a major point of discussion later. The Mary Celeste was carrying 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol. It was being shipped to Italy to be used to fortify wine. This wasn't the kind of alcohol you could drink. It was raw, industrial-grade stuff. It was also highly flammable. On November 7th, 1872, the Mary Celeste sailed out of New York Harbor. The weather was decent. Captain Briggs wrote a letter to his mother just before they left. He sounded happy and optimistic. He was proud of the ship. He was happy to have his wife and daughter with him. Everything was normal. About a month later, another ship was making its way across the Atlantic. This was the Dei Gratia, a Canadian brigantine. Its captain was David Morehouse. He and Captain Briggs knew each other. They were friends. Some accounts say they even had dinner together the night before the Mary Celeste departed. The Dei Gratia had left New York about a week after the Mary Celeste and was following a similar route. On December 4th, 1872, halfway between the Azores and Portugal, the lookout on the Dei Gratia spotted a ship. It was about 5 miles off their port bow. The man at the helm, John Johnson, looked through his spyglass. The ship was moving strangely. It was yawing, drifting in the wind. Its sails were a mess. Some were set, others were torn and flapping uselessly. It looked like a ship with no one at the wheel. Captain Morehouse came on deck. He recognized the vessel. It was the Mary Celeste. He was immediately concerned. Why was it in such a state? He hailed the ship. No answer. He hailed again. Silence. The ship just drifted, an empty vessel on a vast ocean. Something was very wrong. Morehouse ordered his chief mate, Oliver DeVoe, to take a couple of men and board her. They lowered a small boat and rowed across the choppy water. The closer they got, the stranger it seemed. There was no one on deck. No one at the helm. Just the creak of the rigging and the sound of the waves slapping against the hull. DeVoe and his men climbed aboard. The deck was wet. There was water sloshing between the decks, about 3.5 feet of it in the hold. But this wasn't unusual for a ship of this era. It wasn't enough to cause alarm or suggest the ship was sinking. The pumps could handle it. In fact, they found one of the pumps had been disassembled, as if someone had started to repair it. They called out, "Hello? Anyone aboard?" The only answer was the echo of their own voices. They went through the ship, cabin by cabin. The galley was tidy. There were provisions, food, and water to last for 6 months. No meals were left, half eaten on the table. That was a myth that came later. The crew's quarters were empty, their sea chests and pipes still there. Their wet weather gear, their oilskin boots were left behind. This was strange. A sailor would not abandon ship in the North Atlantic in winter without his foul weather gear. They went to the captain's cabin. It was in good order. Captain Briggs's clothes were neatly folded. His wife's things were there, along with some of their daughter's toys. On the table, a sewing machine had a small vial of oil sitting on it, perfectly upright, suggesting the ship hadn't gone through any exceptionally violent weather. The ship's logbook was on the mate's desk. The last entry was dated November 25th at 8 a.m. It recorded the ship's position as being just off the Azores. Everything noted in the log was routine, normal weather, normal sailing. There was no mention of any distress. For 10 days, from November 25th to December 4th, the ship had sailed over 700 nautical miles with nobody at the helm. But there were things missing. The ship's single lifeboat, a small yawl, was gone. It seemed to have been launched properly, not torn away in a storm. The ship's chronometer, a vital navigational tool, was missing. So was the captain's sextant. These were the instruments you needed to figure out where you were. You would only take them if you were leaving the ship on purpose and planned to navigate somewhere else. The ship's papers, except for the logbook, were also gone. Then there were a few odd details that would fuel speculation for years. Under the captain's bed, a sword was found. It had some reddish stains on it. On the ship's rail, there were a couple of deep cuts, as if made by an axe, and 2 of the hatches to the cargo hold were open. The cargo itself, the 1,701 barrels of alcohol, was mostly intact. When they eventually unloaded it in Genoa, they found that 9 of the barrels were empty. These barrels were made of red oak, which was more porous than the white oak used for the other barrels. So, this was the scene. A sound ship. Plenty of food and water. Personal belongings left behind. But no people. No lifeboat, and a few crucial pieces of navigational equipment gone. The crew of the Dei Gratia was baffled. What could have happened? They couldn't just leave the ship there. It was a valuable vessel with a valuable cargo. Captain Morehouse decided to split his crew. He sent his mate DeVoe and 2 other men to sail the Mary Celeste to Gibraltar, the nearest port. It was a difficult journey. The ship was undermanned. They ran into a bad storm. But after a couple of weeks, both the Dei Gratia and the Mary Celeste arrived in Gibraltar. And that's when the mystery really began, because the official investigation turned into a circus of suspicion. The man in charge was the Attorney General of Gibraltar, a man named Frederick Solly Flood. Flood was convinced a crime had been committed. He was a suspicious, stubborn man, and he hated mysteries he couldn't solve with a simple, villainous explanation. He couldn't accept that the crew had just vanished. Someone had to be lying. His first theory was that the crew of the Dei Gratia had found the Mary Celeste, murdered everyone on board, and brought the ship to Gibraltar to claim the salvage money. It was a serious accusation. He had the ship searched from top to bottom by his men. They were looking for evidence of foul play. The stains on the sword were tested. They turned out not to be blood. It was most likely rust. The cuts on the rail were examined. They were strange, but they didn't prove a murder had taken place. There were no signs of a struggle anywhere on the ship. And besides, Captain Morehouse and Captain Briggs were friends. It seemed impossible that he would murder Briggs, his wife, and his small child for salvage money. Flood's next theory was that the crew of the Mary Celeste had gotten into the alcohol, gotten drunk, and murdered Captain Briggs and his family. Then, in a fit of panicked remorse, they fled in the lifeboat. This theory had problems too. First, the alcohol was denatured. It was basically poison. It wasn't drinkable. Second, Briggs was known as a fair captain, and the crew had good reputations. A violent, drunken mutiny seemed completely out of character for everyone involved. And if they had mutinied, why would they leave the ship? Why not just sail it to a port and disappear? Why abandon a perfectly good vessel in the middle of the ocean and take your chances in a tiny open boat? Flood's investigation dragged on for 3 months. He found nothing. No proof of a crime. No proof of anything. In the end, the salvage court awarded the crew of the Dei Gratia some money, but it was much less than it should have been. The judge still held some suspicion, a feeling that something wasn't right about their story. The official inquiry ended without a conclusion. It just documented the mystery. And, in doing so, it created a legend. With no official answer, everyone started coming up with their own ideas. The theories ranged from the plausible to the completely bizarre. Let's start with the human explanations. Pirates were a popular early theory, but it doesn't fit the facts. Pirates would have taken the valuable cargo. They would have taken the money, the jewelry, and anything else of value in the captain's cabin. But all of that was still there. The only thing missing was the crew. Pirates attacked for profit, not to kidnap 10 people and leave everything else behind. What about a mutiny? We've already touched on why that's unlikely. The crew had no reason to mutiny. And if they did, their actions make no sense. Like, why abandon the ship? So people started to look for more complex answers. A strong theory centers on the cargo, the denatured alcohol. Remember, 9 of the barrels were found empty. These were the porous red oak barrels. It's possible that over the course of the journey, alcohol fumes from these barrels leaked out and collected in the hold. Captain Briggs may have become worried about the risk of an explosion. Denatured alcohol is extremely volatile. The slightest spark could set it off. This leads to what is perhaps the most widely accepted and logical theory. It goes something like this. On November 25th, Captain Briggs, concerned about the fumes, ordered the cargo hatches to be opened to ventilate the hold. Maybe there was a rumbling sound from the hold, or a small harmless vapor explosion that blew off one of the hatch covers. It might not have been a big explosion, it wouldn't have damaged the ship, but it would have been terrifying. Briggs, fearing a much larger catastrophic explosion was imminent, would have made a quick decision. The priority would have been to get his wife and young daughter to safety, so he orders everyone to abandon ship. But not permanently, just temporarily. The plan is to get everyone into the lifeboat, tie it to the Mary Celeste with a long rope, and wait at a safe distance to see if the ship explodes. This explains why they took the chronometer and the sextant. If the ship did go up in flames, they would need those instruments to navigate to safety in the small lifeboat. It was a sensible precaution. They launch the lifeboat, everyone gets in, they are trailing behind the Mary Celeste, connected by a tow line. And then, the unexpected happens. The wind picks up suddenly. The Mary Celeste, with some of its sails still set, catches the wind and starts to move faster. Or maybe the tow line, which might have been the main peak halyard and already frayed from use, simply snaps. Suddenly, the 10 people in the lifeboat are separated from their ship. They watch as it sails away from them, faster than they can row. They are left in a tiny boat in the middle of the vast Atlantic Ocean with a storm probably brewing. Their chances of survival would have been almost zero. They would have been swamped by a large wave or died of exposure. The Mary Celeste, meanwhile, would just sail on an empty ship until the Dei Gratia found it 10 days later. This theory fits most of the facts. It explains why the lifeboat was missing. It explains why the navigational instruments were taken. It explains why the crew left behind their personal belongings and rain gear. They thought they were only leaving for a short time. It explains the open hatches. It even explains the disassembled pump. Perhaps they were trying to pump out bilge water, heard the rumbling from the hold, and abandoned the repair in their haste to evacuate. It's a story not of murder or monsters, but of a prudent captain making a reasonable decision that went tragically wrong due to a simple accident. A snapped rope. It's a very human, very believable tragedy. There are other, more dramatic natural explanations. One is the idea of a sequake, an underwater earthquake that can cause the sea to bubble and churn violently. This could have been frightening enough to make Briggs think the ship was about to be destroyed, prompting an evacuation. Another theory involves a waterspout. A massive waterspout could have sucked water up from the ocean and dumped it on the ship, explaining the water in the hold and creating chaos and panic. In the confusion, the lifeboat could have been launched and then lost. And then there are the wild theories. The ones that have made the Mary Celeste a household name. For a while, people loved to blame a giant squid or some other unknown sea monster. The idea was that a colossal creature rose from the depths, plucked everyone from the deck one by one, and disappeared back into the ocean. There's zero evidence for this, of course. It's pure fantasy. Another popular fantasy is alien abduction. The crew was simply beamed up into a UFO. Again, it's a fun story for a late-night talk show, but it's not a serious explanation. The Mary Celeste also often gets lumped in with the Bermuda Triangle, but the ship was nowhere near the Bermuda Triangle when it was found. It was thousands of miles away in the North Atlantic. A lot of the myths we associate with the Mary Celeste didn't even come from the original event. They came from a short story written in 1884 by a young author named Arthur Conan Doyle, the man who would later create Sherlock Holmes. His story, J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement, was a fictionalized account of the incident. In his version, the ship is found with cups of tea still warm on the table, meals laid out uneaten, and a pipe still smoking. These details created a powerful image of a crew that vanished in an instant in the middle of their daily routine. It was great fiction, but it was just that fiction. None of those things were found on the real Mary Celeste. But Doyle's story was so popular that his fictional details became part of the public memory of the event, blurring the line between fact and legend. The fate of the Mary Celeste itself seems to confirm its reputation as an unlucky ship. After the salvage case in Gibraltar, it was sold and passed through 17 more owners over the next decade. It was a cursed ship. No one wanted it. Captains and crews were spooked by its history. Its final owner, a captain named G.C. Parker, deliberately wrecked it off the coast of Haiti in 1885. He loaded it with a worthless cargo of old boots and cat food, claimed it was valuable goods, and ran it onto a reef. He then set it on fire. He was trying to commit insurance fraud, but the ship refused to cooperate. It didn't burn completely, and it didn't sink. The insurance investigators easily discovered the fraud, and Parker was ruined. The wreck of the Mary Celeste sat on that reef, a skeletal reminder of its strange history, until it was finally broken apart by the sea. For more than a century, its final resting place was lost, until its remains were identified by marine archaeologists in 2001. So, what really happened? The truth is, we will never know for sure. There are no survivors. There was no final message. All we have are the clues left behind on an empty ship. The silence is what makes the story so powerful. It's a vacuum that we can't help but fill with our own fears and imagination. But the most likely story is probably the least dramatic one. It's the story of Captain Briggs, a good man faced with a potential danger he couldn't ignore. The fear of an explosion from the alcohol fumes is a solid, rational explanation for abandoning the ship. He was a professional. He was also a husband and a father. His first instinct would have been to protect his family and his crew. He wasn't panicking, he was taking a calculated risk. Move everyone to the lifeboat, wait for the danger to pass, and then reboard. It was a good plan. But the ocean is unforgiving. A single snapped rope, a sudden gust of wind, and a good plan becomes a death sentence. The image is haunting. 10 people in a small boat watching their only hope, their ship, their home, sail away from them over the horizon, leaving them to their fate. The story of the Mary Celeste isn't really about ghosts or monsters or aliens. It's about how quickly things can go wrong at sea. It's about how a series of small, logical decisions can lead to an absolute catastrophe. And it's a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying mysteries are the ones that have a simple, tragic, and deeply human explanation at their core. We're left with the story of Arthur Briggs, the 7-year-old boy who stayed home to go to school. He grew up, had a family of his own, but he never knew for certain what happened to his parents and his little sister. He just knew that one day they sailed away and never came back. The Mary Celeste sailed on, but its people were lost to the sea, and their story was lost to silence. And that silence is what we hear today, nearly 150 years later, whenever someone tells the tale of the ship that came home without its crew.